with the possible exceptions of our contributions from Portugal and Sweden, quite a lot of it has been very London-centric. And the theme of this conference is after phone hacking. So let's think about what we can do after phone hacking to make things a lot better. Here's another example. And this is Liz Carr, who was talking about Paralympic athletes. And again, this is a sort of classic example of the triumph over tragedy story. And you can just imagine the devastating effect that some of these stories can have on people who are, to put it very crudely, fat, never get much beyond their sofa. Not is it going to make them want to stay on their sofa, it'll probably make some of them feel like going to bed and never getting up again. It really is quite devastating. In my 12 minutes, Anthony, I just wanted to talk about, am I still okay?
You have 4 minutes.
4 minutes left. Novelty. Where does novelty fall down? Because novelty, of course, is the most important of the news values. The thing about novelty is that it's all about extremes, isn't it? It's all about firsts, lasts, biggest, best. So what this does is to take us away from what is representative towards these extremes. And yet this is one of the key things that journalists look to when they're thinking about using medical case histories. And I think we have to accept too that there's a whole range of people who have abused patients in the most abysmal way. And I could give you a lot of examples, but there isn't time. I'm aware of that, Anthony. But let's just take one case here. This is something that's, doctors are involved in this as well. Now, you can actually read this slide far quicker than I can read it. So I'm not going to read it out to you. But has everyone read it? Has everyone got the message? Okay, in the interest of time, I will move quickly on to the next slide. ED, by the way, I should have said ED, that is erectile dysfunction, just in case anyone was unaware of that. Now, I'm sure this doesn't come as a surprise to anybody, but it is something that we should be trying to do something about. One of my favorite quotations. Because you would think, wouldn't you, that when people were talking to journalists, they would be extremely apprehensive about what they used to say. I used to do a lot of interviews at home in the evening, often late at night, and I would record these interviews with, I hasten to add, the permission of the interviewees. And my wife was often working away on a desk quite near me, and she was shocked by just how much people would say. And I think this is another area in which we have to recognize that patients need protection. And we're talking about an issue here that is actually far, far bigger than phone hacking. Phone hacking that directly affects, or has directly affected so far, only a few hundred people. Of course, it's desperately important, but what I'm talking about actually impacts on millions of people's lives, and it's not something that's been recognized. Read this. This is actually a fictional account, but every medical journalist who reads this says, I've been there, I really have been there. And it's quite, again, it's quite shocking, but somewhere, someone needs to do something about it. That's my lot. I hope I was kept to my deadline.
Yeah. That's around, John, thanks. Question.
You can ask me an aggressive question now.
Happen to be involved in a medical arts into
Yes.
It was absolutely fascinating, and you know, being from a broadcast background, was really interested in how they kind of position themselves maybe as filmmakers rather than journalists, but then also this new trend for these 24-hour programs in hospitals and getting patient consent, and they were incredibly thoughtful about the way to do that. I just wondered whether you had any views on patient participation in those kind of films and the sort of ethical considerations.
I don't think I would make a distinction between patient participation in those kinds of films and patient participation in a standard media interview. In fact, I think there is potentially far more of a threat in an article that appears in a newspaper or magazine or goes online, because there is a permanence about that there isn't about a broadcast. So your point is well made. And in fact, I'm now writing a book which is called Handling the Media, Communication Skills for Healthcare Professionals. And a very important chapter in it addresses questions like these. And they are of fundamental importance. So thank you for the question.
Wonder what you thought about the complicity between journalists and fundraising organisations for charity, for research rather. So I'm thinking of cancer, breast cancer.
Yeah.
Now all the cancers, breast cancer has probably been one of the best research because it's had an enormous amount of money come into it through public interest generated through media stories, which in turn have largely been generated by cancer foundations, cancer associations, using daffodil days.
Well, I think again your point is extremely well made, and I think there is a kind of abuse there, but the same kind of thing happens in the NHS, and I can, there was a story involving my former colleague Oliver Gilley, and he used to be the medical correspondent on the Sunday Times and the medical editor on the Independent. He was also actually my first boss in medical journalism. And he was interviewing this child who was in an iron lung. This was some years ago, admittedly. And the hospital set up this interview with the consent of the parents, but it was quite obvious to Oliver that the child was extremely uncomfortable about it all. So what you have here is a situation where a hospital stands to make a lot of money in charity donations through stories like that, but that money is made at the expense of the patients. And this happens in charities, it happens in the NHS. The Birmingham Children's Hospital, for example, raise about £1 to £2 million a year, and they rely a lot on media stories to do that. In fact, they've just written some guidelines to address the issues that we're talking about.
And the point being that the funds raised are actually a benefit to patients.
Yes.
So
yes.
It's not always as simple.
It's immensely complex. That's what makes it so interesting.
So we best move on. We've got one more paper, and Helen has put back dinner, lunch. I mean, until 1:15, so there's no point going because there won't be any food for 15 minutes. So we've got our last paper now. Kamel Zegout from University of Sorbonne in France, in Paris.
Thank you. I had a PowerPoint presentation, but it will be too short. So the title of the paper is From Public Interest to Which is of Interest to the Public, Between Values and Practices. I'm sorry for my French accent. I will try to So the aim of this paper is essentially to clarify the distinction between two notions, public interest and which is of interest to the public. We want to highlight the subtlety of both expressions through their deconstruction in different reading levels in order to identify concepts that refer to similar imaginaries but whose goals in reality are opposed. So by achieving a more comprehensive understanding of the notion of public interest and its development in the media context, the challenge is to become aware of the need for a civic role of media in the British society. First of all, the concept of public interest, which is often balanced by the issue of which is of interest to the public, tends to aggregate central questions about the way the press is governed and the way it is balanced between different levels of meaning. The distinction between the two expressions is blurring in the United Kingdom in light of recent court decisions relating to the disclosure of personal information of high-profile public figures. Think about the court case of Max Mosley against the News of the World in 2008. So between public interest and which is of interest to the public, there are connotations which distinguish the two concepts, two expressions. So as part of this dichotomy, we distinguish two levels of meaning for each of the two expressions. The first level of meaning is a statutory level. So in this point of view, public interest can be seen as a defense in certain legal cases. The Legal Act of 1843 talks about the public benefit, but also as an exemption. For instance, in the Freedom of Information Act of 2000, which stresses that the public interest must not be used on its own to refuse to disclose information. It must only be used in conjunction with an exemption. Generally speaking, if we attempt to define this concept, public interest refers to the common good and to the general interest of the whole society without any distinction of persons. That's an important point. So public interest also refers to the idea of public service. The British law refers to the public policy. So by considering that there is no fixed definition of public interest, the BBC in its editorial guidelines highlights that public interest includes, but is not confined to, exposing or detecting crime, exposing significant antisocial behavior, exposing corruption or injustice, disclosing significant incompetence or negligence, protecting people's health and safety, preventing people from being misled by some statement or action of an individual or organization, and disclosing information that assists people to better comprehend or make decisions on matters of public importance. Otherwise, the BBC adds that there is also a public interest in freedom of expression itself. So the BBC focuses on elements of definition of the concept of public interest as defined by the PCC, the Press Complaints Commission, while expanding the definition of the PCC by the introduction of key issues that underpin the concept of public interest in journalism. The first idea is the journalist's role of watchdog, not only towards politicians, but also towards all that may be contrary to the public morals and may have negative consequences in terms of social cohesion and more broadly in terms of democracy. The second idea is the journalistic responsibility to inform and to analyze in order to have the public in a better understanding of the issues at stake and have the public to form opinions. So as a concept mentioned, but not explicitly defined in UK law and defined by examples in the text of regulators of print journalism, which leaves room to newspaper companies to interpret the scope of this concept. The concept of public interest raises debates. As a normative